A woman was in a hurry to catch the bus, but she decided to help a lost boy and take him home. When she reached his home, she was horrified to see who opened the door. Sophia woke up early as usual, with the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains of her modest apartment. The clock showed 6 a.m., but for her, time had lost its true meaning since that fateful day. Her daily routine was her only anchor, the only thread keeping her connected to life, even though everything else felt like a grey blur. She got up slowly, feeling the creak in her joints, a reminder of the years that had passed since her life changed forever. She went to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was almost unrecognizable. Her eyes, once full of sparkle and joy, were now dull, surrounded by dark shadows. The wrinkles on her face were not just the result of time, but also of endless nights of tears and constant worry that had consumed her since Daniel disappeared. After a quick shower, she dressed in the same clothes she wore almost every day, a pair of worn-out jeans and a simple shirt. There was no need to dress up. She no longer cared what others thought. She ate breakfast in silence, barely touching the food. Despite the loneliness that surrounded her, Sophia always set the table for two, as if still expecting Daniel to run through the door, asking for his favorite cereal. But she knew that wouldn't happen. She left her apartment at 7:30 in the morning, just as she did every day. She walked towards the subway station, feeling the cool morning breeze on her face. As she headed to work, she passed by the same park where she used to take Daniel when he was little. That place, once filled with laughter and joy, was now a constant reminder of the void in her life. Sophia avoided looking at the park, but today, for some reason, her eyes strayed toward it. She saw a group of children playing, and her heart clenched as she remembered her little one, happily running with his frisbee. She quickened her pace, wanting to leave those painful memories behind. The day at the office passed without incident, as always. Sophia worked as an administrative assistant in a small company, a job she once enjoyed, but now it was just a distraction from her constant pain. Papers piled up on her desk, and she went through them with mechanical efficiency, without really paying attention to what she was doing. Her colleagues, aware of her tragedy, had long since stopped trying to cheer her up. The office was full of murmurs and laughter, but Sophia kept to herself, immersed in her own world of memories and longings. At the end of the day, when the clock struck 6 in the evening, Sophia gathered her things and headed for the door. The sky was already starting to darken, and she knew she had to hurry to catch the last bus. She walked quickly through the streets of Chicago, feeling the night beginning to envelop the city. As she walked, she couldn't help but think of Andrew, her ex-husband, with whom she had shared so much love and so much pain. Since the separation, they barely spoke, but deep down, Sophia knew he was suffering too. The memory of the happy moments they shared weighed heavily on her heart, and the regret of not being able to save their marriage tormented her daily. Just as she was about to cross the street to reach the bus stop, something caught her attention. A few meters away, under the flickering light of a lamppost, she saw a small boy, no older than 7, standing alone on the sidewalk. His small body shivered with cold, and his large, frightened eyes desperately searched for someone to help him. Sophia felt a knot in her stomach at the sight of the boy, a mix of compassion and a painful déjà vu that momentarily paralyzed her. The bus was about to arrive, and Sophia knew that if she didn't hurry, she would miss it. But she couldn't ignore the boy. Something inside her, perhaps that maternal instinct that had been dormant for years of pain, pushed her to approach him. She walked over to the boy, crouching down to his level, and spoke softly. "Hi there, little one. Are you okay?" she asked, trying to sound calm, though her heart was pounding. The boy looked at her with tear-filled eyes and shook his head. I got lost," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to get home." Sophia felt a pang in her heart. She couldn't leave him alone, not when she knew so well what it felt like to lose someone you love. Without thinking twice, she made a decision. "Don't worry, I'll take you home," she said with a reassuring smile, taking his small hand in hers. The bus drove past, but Sophia barely noticed. She had made a choice, and although she didn't know at that moment how it would change her life, she was certain she couldn't have done otherwise. She walked alongside the boy, Matthew, as he gave her directions to his home. As they moved through the streets, Sophia felt as if something larger than herself was guiding her, a feeling she couldn't explain. Her mind kept returning again and again to Daniel, wondering if someone had ever helped him when he needed it. It was a thought that had haunted her for years, and now at least she could help another child, as no one had been able to do for her own. The journey was short, but each step seemed to take Sophia deeper and deeper into a spiral of emotions she hadn't felt in a long time. When they finally arrived at Matthew's home, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. Something wasn't right, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Matthew pointed to the door and, without letting go of her hand, urged her to ring the bell. Sophia took a deep breath and rang the bell, hoping to find worried and relieved parents. What she found on the other side of the door changed her life forever. Sophia stood motionless for a moment after ringing the bell. The night's cold wrapped around her, but her mind was so focused on the boy beside her and the door in front of her that she barely noticed. Matthew still clung to her hand, his small body trembling slightly, now not only from the cold, but also from the mix of fear and relief he surely felt being so close to home. As she waited for someone to answer the door, Sophia couldn't help but think about what she had lost. Matthew's hand in hers, so small and fragile, reminded her of Daniel's when he was a child. Sometimes Daniel was scared by simple things like the dark or a loud noise, and Sophia was always there to comfort him, to assure him that everything would be okay. Now, years later, here she was, holding the hand of another lost child, trying to offer him the same reassurance she once gave her own son. The door opened with a soft creak, pulling Sophia out of her thoughts. Her gaze slowly lifted, finding the person on the other side of the door. In that instant, Sophia's world stopped. There, standing in the doorway, was a man who, despite the years, was unmistakable to her. Her heart skipped a beat, and a sense of vertigo washed over her. He looked at her with a mix of surprise and courtesy, without the slightest hint of recognition in his eyes. Sophia felt her knees weaken, and she had to make an effort to maintain her composure. "Thank you for bringing Matthew home," the man said with a warm smile as he extended his hand to receive the boy. Sophia could barely process what she was seeing. The face in front of her was Daniel's, her son, but he had changed. He had aged. His face bore a maturity she couldn't associate with the child she remembered, but those eyes were unmistakable. They were the same eyes she had desperately searched for in the crowd that day at the park, the same eyes she had dreamed of seeing every night since his disappearance. "You're welcome," Sophia responded, her voice shaky, her mind still trying to process what was happening. Matthew ran to the man, wrapping his arms around his leg with the familiarity of a child returning to his father. The man, with a tenderness only a father could have, stroked Matthew's head before looking up at Sophia again. "Thank you for taking the time to bring him back," the man said with gratitude in his voice. "My wife and I were very worried." Those words cut through Sophia like a knife. Her son, her Daniel, was married, had a family, a life she didn't know. How could he not recognize her? What had happened to him all these years? The questions crowded her mind, each one more painful than the last. "You're welcome," Sophia repeated, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I was just passing by." The man nodded, apparently not noticing Sophia's internal struggle. To him, she was just a good Samaritan who had helped his son. There was no sign of recognition, no spark of memory in his eyes. To him, she was a stranger. "Would you like to come in?" the man offered, still with that polite smile. Sophia felt the ground beneath her feet crumble. Everything inside her wanted to scream, wanted to hug him, tell him she was his mother, that she had spent years searching for him, but the words didn't come. Instead, all she could do was shake her head. "No, thank you," she quickly replied. "I have to go as it's late." The man nodded again with a look of understanding. "I understand." "Thank you again," he said, taking Matthew's hand and beginning to close the door. Sophia nodded one last time before turning around, her legs moving automatically, carrying her back towards the bus stop. She was barely aware of her surroundings. Her entire being was focused on the fact that she had found Daniel, but he hadn't found her. As she walked, her mind remained tangled in a web of confusing thoughts and heartbreaking emotions. She remembered every detail of Daniel's face, every gesture, every inflection in his voice. There was no doubt that man was her son, but what had happened to him? Why didn't he remember her? What kind of life had he lived to not know who she was? Finally, she reached the bus stop, her breathing quick and shallow. The bus hadn't arrived yet, giving her a few moments to try to calm down, though her heart still pounded. She sat on the bench and looked up at the night sky, trying to find some comfort in the distant twinkling stars. But all she felt was deep sadness and overwhelming confusion. When the bus arrived, she boarded almost automatically, paid her fare, and collapsed into an empty seat by the window. On the ride home, she couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, or Mark, as he now seemed to be called, opening the door with not the slightest trace of recognition in his eyes. It was as if all those years she had spent searching for him, suffering from his loss, had been meaningless. Back in her apartment, Sophia closed the door behind her and collapsed on the couch, hugging her knees as the tears finally began to fall. The relief of knowing Daniel was alive was overshadowed by the devastating reality that he didn't recognize her, that her life had been completely separated from his. For years, she had clung to the hope that one day she would find him, and that he would run to her with open arms, shouting, "Mom," as he used to do. But that fantasy had vanished the moment he smiled at her kindly, as if she were just another stranger. Sophia cried until she had no more tears left, her body trembling with the force of her sobs. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to move on, knowing that Daniel was out there, so close and yet so far away at the same time. Everything she had dreamed of, everything she had lived for, had turned into a nightmare from which she didn't know how to wake up. Finally, she got up from the couch and went to her bedroom. She lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind blank. The pain in her chest was almost unbearable, but she knew she had no choice but to keep going, even if she didn't know how. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion take over, wishing that when she woke up, it would all have been just a bad dream. But deep down in her heart, she knew it wasn't. Daniel was alive, but she had lost her son forever. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Sophia's modest house, but she didn't move. She had been awake for hours, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her mind trapped in the whirlwind of emotions she had experienced the night before. The memory of Daniel's face, now Mark, remained etched in her mind, every detail as vivid as if she were seeing him again. There was no escaping the reality she had discovered, and she knew she had to face it, even though she had no idea how. Finally, when the clock struck 7 in the morning, Sophia forced herself out of bed. Every movement felt heavy, as if an invisible force was trying to keep her in bed, but she knew that staying there wouldn't change anything. She dressed in the same clothes as the day before, not paying much attention to what she was doing, and headed to the bathroom. The face she saw in the mirror looked even more worn and tired than the day before, if that was possible. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying, were a reflection of the internal storm consuming her. After a quick shower, she made herself a strong coffee, though she knew nothing could lift the fog in her mind. Sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, she tried to think about her next step. She couldn't ignore what had happened. She couldn't just continue with her life as if nothing had changed. Daniel, her son, was alive, but he didn't remember her. That was the harsh truth. But what should she do now? Should she approach him and try to make him remember, or should she let him live his life without interfering in the new reality he had built? The sound of the phone interrupted her thoughts, abruptly pulling her out of her reverie. When she looked at the screen, she saw the name Mary, her sister, lighting up the device. For a moment, Sophia considered not answering. She wasn't ready to talk about what had happened, not even with Mary, but she knew her sister wouldn't stop until she got answers, so she took a deep breath and picked up. "Sophia." Mary's voice sounded worried on the other end of the line. "I've called you several times. Are you okay?" Sophia paused, weighing her words. How could she explain what she had experienced the night before? How could she put into words the pain and confusion that had consumed her? "I found him," was all she could say, her voice barely a whisper. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Mary didn't need Sophia to specify who she was referring to. They both knew it could only be Daniel. "What, where?" Mary asked, her voice now tinged with disbelief. Sophia told her everything from the moment she saw Matthew under the lamppost to the instant Daniel, now known as Mark, opened the door. The words came out of her mouth with difficulty, but once she started, she couldn't stop. It was as if, by telling the story, she was trying to make sense of what had happened, as if by sharing her pain with Mary, she could lighten some of the burden she felt on her shoulders. Mary listened in silence, only occasionally interrupting with a gentle question to clarify some detail. When Sophia finished, there was a prolonged silence on the line before Mary finally spoke. "We have to do something," Mary said with determination. "We can't let this be. He's Daniel. He's our Daniel. He needs to know the truth." "But he doesn't remember me," Sophia replied, her voice breaking. "I don't even know if I should say anything. What if I destroy his life? What if, by trying to reach out, I lose him forever?" "You haven't lost him, Sophia. You found him. Now it's up to us to decide how to proceed, but we can't just let him continue living a lie. He deserves to know who he really is, who we are." Mary's words made sense, but fear still gripped Sophia. The thought of facing Daniel again, of trying to explain everything, terrified her. But at the same time, she knew Mary was right. She couldn't stand by while her son, her little Daniel, lived without knowing his true identity. "I need time," Sophia finally said, her voice barely audible. "I can't do this alone." "You don't have to do it alone," Mary replied firmly. "I'll be with you every step of the way. We'll find a way to reach out to him, to tell him the truth, but we'll do it carefully. We're not alone in this." Mary's words gave Sophia a small comfort, but the weight of the situation still pressed on her chest. After hanging up, she sat in silence for several minutes, her mind working a mile a minute. She knew she had to contact Andrew, Daniel's father. Despite the distance that had grown between them since their separation, Andrew had the right to know what had happened, had the right to decide how to proceed. The rest of the day passed in a kind of fog for Sophia. She called Andrew later that afternoon, her heart pounding as she waited for him to answer. When he did, he was initially distant, but as soon as Sophia mentioned Daniel, his tone changed immediately. "What are you saying, Sophia?" Andrew asked, his voice tinged with disbelief and repressed hope. "How do you know it's him?" "I know, Andrew. I can't explain it, but I know he's our Daniel. He didn't recognize me, but those eyes, they were the same." Andrew was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. After a few seconds that felt like hours to Sophia, he responded with a firm voice. "We need to see him. I need to see him with my own eyes. We can't act rashly, but we can't ignore this either." They agreed to meet the next day at the park where Sophia had found Matthew, the same park where they had lost Daniel so many years ago. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them, but they both knew it was the right place to start planning their next steps. That night, Sophia could barely sleep. Memories from the past, images of Daniel as a child, mingled with the face of Mark, creating a kaleidoscope of emotions that kept her awake. She wondered how the reunion with Andrew would be, how they would face this new reality together. Finally, dawn arrived, bringing with it Sophia's determination to do whatever it took to get her son back, even though the path ahead was uncertain and terrifying. The next day, the park was almost deserted when Sophia arrived, just as it had been so many years ago, the day that changed her life forever. Every corner of that place seemed steeped in memories, echoes of Daniel's laughter as he chased his frisbee, the happy moments they had shared before everything fell apart. Sophia paused near the entrance, her heart pounding as her eyes scanned the familiar landscape. She felt a lump in her throat, a mix of pain and nostalgia that almost paralyzed her, but she knew she couldn't turn back. She had come too far to stop now. She glanced at the watch on her wrist, noticing that only a few minutes remained until the agreed time. Andrew would arrive soon, and together they would face what she still couldn't fully comprehend. How was it possible that her son was alive, so close and yet so far at the same time? And worse, how would Andrew handle this reality after all the failed attempts to leave behind the tragedy that had shattered them? The sound of soft footsteps on the pavement pulled her out of her thoughts. She turned her head and saw Andrew approaching, his figure thin and bent from the years of carrying his own weight of guilt and pain. Despite everything, there was something in his walk that signaled a firm determination, a resolve that Sophia recognized well. When their eyes met, no words were needed to express what they were both feeling. The silence between them was filled with a mix of emotions only they could understand. "Sophia," Andrew finally said, his voice rough with restrained emotion. "I didn't know if I could do this, but here I am." Sophia nodded, not trusting her own voice. She moved closer to him, and for a moment they stood there, facing each other, sharing an unspoken understanding of what they were about to face. "Are you sure?" Andrew asked after a while, his gaze searching Sophia's for confirmation. "Are you sure it's him?" Sophia took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs before answering. "I know it, Andrew. I don't know how to explain it, but I know. It's Daniel. Something inside me just knows." Andrew nodded slowly, as if processing that reality was almost impossible. Then he looked up at the park, his eyes sweeping over the place that had witnessed their greatest happiness and their worst nightmare. "Then we have to face it," he finally said, with renewed determination in his voice. "But we have to be careful, Sophia. We can't just burst into his life and expect everything to fall into place right away. We can't risk losing him again." Sophia agreed, knowing Andrew was right. Every step they took from now on had to be measured, every move calculated to avoid causing more harm than had already been done. "Mary is investigating," Sophia added, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "She's found some inconsistencies in Mark adoption. We need to know more before we make any decisions." "Good," Andrew replied, his voice a mix of relief and concern. "That's the right thing to do. We can't act rashly." Silence fell over them again, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees. For a long time, they simply walked together through the park, as if the movement could help them process the avalanche of emotions suffocating them. At some point, Andrew stopped in front of a bench where they used to sit with Daniel. Sophia watched him in silence, noticing how his shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of the memory was crushing him. "How will we do this, Sophia?" Andrew finally asked, his voice cracked by desperation. "How do we tell our son that his whole life has been a lie?" Sophia didn't have a clear answer. She felt the same uncertainty as Andrew, the same fear of ruining what was left of their relationship with Daniel, or Mark, as he was now known. She knew that what was at stake was much more than just getting their son back. They were about to forever change the life of a man who, as far as he knew, had lived a full life, though based on a lie. "I don't know," Sophia whispered. "But we have to try. I can't just stay here and do nothing. Not after everything we've been through." Andrew nodded, pressing his lips into a thin line. He was a man of few words, but Sophia knew he shared her feelings. He was willing to do whatever it took to get their son back, even though the path to that goal was uncertain and fraught with danger. "We'll need Mary," Andrew finally said, his tone pragmatic once more. "She has to find out everything she can before we take the next step. And when we have all the facts, then we'll decide how to proceed." Sophia agreed. Mary had always been the most sensible of the three, and her ability to uncover the truth might be their only hope of handling this situation in the least traumatic way possible. "We'll talk to her tonight," Sophia responded. "We need to have a plan before we approach him." With the plan sketched out, both felt a slight sense of relief, as if having a purpose gave them a reason to stay strong. But deep down, Sophia knew the real challenge was yet to come. What they had discovered was just the beginning, and how they handled what was to follow would determine not only Daniel's future, but their own as well. "Thank you for coming, Andrew," Sophia said softly, realizing how difficult it must have been for him to face this place and everything it represented. "I'll always be here for this, Sophia," Andrew replied, his voice low but full of conviction. "No matter what happened between us, Daniel is all that matters." Sophia felt a lump in her throat but nodded, knowing Andrew's words were sincere. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel a spark of hope. Maybe together they could find a way to make this work, but she knew it would be a long and painful road. As the sun began to descend on the horizon, Sophia and Andrew said goodbye with a silent promise to keep going, to not give up, no matter how hard it would be. They both knew they were about to embark on an emotional journey that would push them to the limit, but they also knew they had no other choice. That night, Sophia returned to her apartment, with a mix of anxiety and determination. She knew they would soon meet with Mary to start unraveling the mystery of Mark's life, but she also knew that the time for planning was running out. Soon they would have to face their son and reveal the truth. And though fear consumed her, she knew she couldn't let it stop her. As she prepared for bed, Sophia couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, her little boy, and what he might be doing at that moment. The image of Mark opening the door continued to haunt her, and she knew that until she could get her son back, that image would be her only comfort and her greatest torment. The next day dawned grey and cloudy, as if the sky mirrored the emotional weight Sophia felt inside. The anxiety had settled in her chest since she woke up, and every passing minute brought her closer to the meeting with Mary, where they would begin to uncover the truth behind Daniel's disappearance. She knew that what they would discover could change everything, but she also knew they couldn't move forward without getting answers. Sophia arrived at Mary's apartment at noon, the cold from outside clinging to her bones. Her sister's small home was warm and colourful, in stark contrast to the somber atmosphere that weighed on Sophia. Mary, with her dark hair pulled into a messy bun and her eyes shining with determination, greeted her with a strong and comforting hug. "I knew you'd come early," Mary said, releasing her and leading her to the kitchen. "I've made coffee and have some documents I want to show you." Sophia nodded, letting herself be carried by the familiarity of the setting. Mary's home had always been a refuge, a place where she could feel safe, even in the worst moments. However, this time, the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. Both knew that what they were about to discover could change their lives forever. Seated at the kitchen table, Mary slid a stack of papers toward Sophia. Her hands trembled slightly as she took them, but she forced herself to focus. She needed to know what was in those documents. She needed to understand what had happened. "I started by reviewing Mark's adoption records," Mary explained, as Sophia began to read. "From the beginning, I noticed some irregularities. The adoption was fast, too fast, and the names of the intermediaries involved don't match normal procedures. Everything seems to have been orchestrated, so that no one would ask too many questions." Sophia frowned as she read the documents, seeing for herself the inconsistencies Mary had mentioned. The dates didn't add up, and the names of the people involved were vague, if not non-existent. It was clear that someone had manipulated the process, but who and why? "Then I found something else," Mary continued, her voice lowering as she slid another document toward Sophia. "The name of a lawyer that appears in several key places, Javier Dominguez. He worked closely with the family that adopted Mark, particularly with Caroline." The name resonated in Sophia's mind. Though she didn't recognize it, the mere fact that there was a person connecting all the dots heightened her unease. "I did some digging on Javier," Mary said, leaning forward with a grave expression. "He's a lawyer who in his time had an impeccable reputation, but a few years ago he disappeared from the radar. He retired abruptly, and since then, he's lived practically in isolation. No one knows much about him now." "What does that mean?" Sophia asked, feeling a chill run down her spine. "It means there's more to this than meets the eye, Sophia. This man was involved in Mark adoption, and not in a legal way. I'm convinced that if we talk to him, he could give us the answers we need." Sophia felt a mix of hope and fear. On the one hand, the possibility of uncovering the truth filled her with renewed energy, but on the other, the fear of what they might find paralyzed her. She knew she couldn't afford to doubt now, not when they were so close to discovering what had really happened to Daniel. "We have to talk to him," she finally said, with more conviction in her voice than she felt in her heart. "If there's anyone who can tell us the truth, it's Javier." Mary nodded, satisfied with her sister's determination. She had anticipated that Sophia would be ready to act, and had already taken the initiative to track down Javier. What she hadn't expected was what she found. "I located Javier," Mary said, as she searched for something on her phone. "He lives on the outskirts of the city, in a small house in a rather isolated neighborhood. I managed to get his address through some contacts, but this won't be easy, Sophia. This man has been in hiding for years. We don't know how he'll react if we show up there." "We have no other choice," Sophia responded, her voice resolute. "I have to know the truth, and if he's the key, we must face him." Mary nodded in silence, seeing the determination in her sister's eyes. She knew she couldn't stop her, and besides, she was just as eager to uncover the truth. They had spent so many years searching for answers that now, so close to them, they couldn't back down. "We'll go this afternoon," Mary decided. "The sooner we confront him, the better." They spent the next few hours preparing what they would say, thinking about how to approach Javier without making him feel cornered. Both knew that this man had the answers they needed, but they also knew that if they weren't careful, he could shut down and refuse to talk. When the clock struck 4 in the afternoon, Sophia and Mary set out for Javier's house, their hearts pounding and their minds full of questions. The drive was silent, with the tension palpable between them. Sophia couldn't stop thinking about what she was about to discover. She felt as if she were walking toward the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether the next step would lead her into an abyss or onto the path to the truth. Finally, they arrived at Javier's house. It was a small, old building with an overgrown garden and windows fogged from lack of maintenance. Everything about the place seemed to reflect its owner's isolation, as if the house itself had decided to disconnect from the outside world. Mary parked the car in front of the house, and they both sat in silence for a moment, staring at the worn facade and feeling the weight of what they were about to do. "Are you ready?" Mary asked, breaking the silence. Sophia nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she opened the car door. She didn't know if she was truly ready, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. Together they walked to the door and Mary rang the bell, the sound echoing like a call in the afternoon stillness. A few seconds passed, which felt like minutes, before they heard slow steps approaching from inside. The door opened with a creak, revealing an older man with graying hair and a face marked by the wrinkles of time and worry. "Javier Dominguez?" Mary asked, keeping her tone firm but polite. The man looked at them with tired but sharp eyes and nodded slowly. "Yes, I am," he replied, his voice hoarse with age. "What do you want?" "We want to talk to you about an adoption you handled years ago," Mary said bluntly. "An adoption that we believe was irregular." Javier's face tensed immediately and his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied and began to close the door, but Sophia stepped forward, stopping him. "Please, we need answers," she said, her voice pleading. "We're not here to judge you. We just want to know the truth. It's about my son, about Daniel." The name seemed to stop Javier in his tracks. His eyes, which had been filled with distrust, showed a flash of recognition and guilt. For a moment he seemed to struggle internally, before he sighed heavily and opened the door wide. "Come in," he said resignedly. "It seems it's time to talk." Sophia and Mary exchanged a glance, feeling a mix of relief and fear, before following Javier inside the house. They knew they were about to hear the truth, a truth that could change everything. The inside of Javier Dominguez's house was as gloomy as its exterior. The light filtering through the windows barely illuminated the space, creating shadows that seemed to envelop every corner of the room. There was a musty smell and the air was thick with the scent of old wood, as if the place had been closed off from the world for too long. Javier, with an expression of resignation, led Sophia and Mary into a small, cluttered living room, where he collapsed into a worn-out armchair. Sophia and Mary sat opposite him on a sofa that had seen better days. For a moment, none of them spoke, the silence thick with tension, as Javier watched them with a mix of weariness and regret. "I know why you're here," he finally said, breaking the silence with a voice that seemed even graver in the dim light of the room. "I've been expecting this moment for years, though I hoped it would never come." Sophia felt a lump in her throat. Javier's words confirmed what she had feared. He knew something that had been hidden all these years. "Then you know what we're here to ask," Mary said, her tone a mix of firmness and caution. "We want to know the truth about Mark's adoption, about Daniel." Javier lowered his gaze to his hands, which rested on his knees, trembling slightly. He seemed to be fighting an internal battle, as if the weight of what he was about to confess was crushing him. "It wasn't an adoption," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "It was a kidnapping." The words fell like a weight on Sophia and Mary. Though both had suspected it, hearing the confirmation was a devastating blow. Sophia felt the air leave her lungs as if her chest was being crushed. Mary, beside her, clenched her hands into fists, trying to maintain her composure. "How did it happen?" Mary asked, keeping her voice low but insistent. "We need to know everything." Javier lifted his gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and pain. "Caroline," he began, swallowing as if the name was hard to say. She was a desperate woman. She had tried to have children for years, but after several miscarriages and a final devastating diagnosis, she knew she could never be a biological mother. Her desperation led her to extreme measures. "And you helped her?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. Javier nodded slowly, unable to meet Sophia's gaze any longer. "I did," he admitted with regret. "She was a close friend of my wife. I knew what she was going through, and in a moment of weakness, I agreed to help her. It all started as a search for a legal adoption, but Caroline, she couldn't wait. When she saw Daniel in the park that day, something broke inside her. She called me that very night, saying she had found the child she always wanted. I knew what she was asking me to do was illegal, immoral, but I wasn't strong enough to stop her." Sophia felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She remembered that day in the park as if it were yesterday, the sun shining, Daniel's laughter as they played together, the feeling of absolute terror when she lost sight of him for just a second. Now knowing that someone had planned to rip him from her side, that someone had turned her life into a nightmare, it was too much to bear. "What exactly did he do?" Mary asked, controlling the tremor in her voice. "We forged documents," Javier responded, his voice lower with each word. "I had contacts in the adoption system, people who were willing to turn a blind eye for the right price. We made it look like Daniel was an abandoned child, that he never had a family. Caroline took him that very night, and I took care of the rest." Tears began to fall down Sophia's face, but she made no sound. She was too stunned, too overwhelmed by Javier's confession. Everything she had feared for years, all the worst scenarios she had imagined, were now reality. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Mary asked, trying to keep calm. "Why did you keep up the lie all these years?" Javier let out a shaky sigh and buried his face in his hands, as if trying to erase the memories. "Because I was terrified," he confessed. "I knew that if I said anything, it would destroy not just Caroline's life, but mine as well. My reputation, my career, everything I had built would crumble, and after a while I convinced myself it was better this way, that Daniel was with a family that loved him, that he was happy. It was a lie I told myself so many times that I came to believe it." Sophia couldn't take it anymore. She abruptly stood up from the sofa, unable to stay in that room a second longer. She stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cold air in a desperate attempt to calm herself. But the pain in her chest was unbearable. She had spent years not knowing what had happened to her son, and now that she finally knew, the truth was far worse than she had imagined. Mary remained in the room for a moment, watching Javier, who still had his head down, lost in his own guilt. "Where is Caroline now?" Mary asked, her tone colder and sharper. "She's still in the same house with Mark and his family," Javier replied without lifting his gaze. "She never stopped being a mother to him, even though she knew it was all based on a lie." Mary nodded, making a mental note of that information. She got up from the sofa, heading toward the door. "Thank you for telling us the truth," Mary said, though her words were filled with bitterness. "But that doesn't change what you did." Javier didn't respond. His silence was enough to show his regret, though nothing he said or did could erase what had already happened. Mary stepped out onto the porch, finding Sophia hugging herself, trembling. She walked over and wrapped her arms around her, trying to offer some comfort in the midst of the emotional chaos engulfing her. "We will find him," Mary whispered, "and we'll make sure he knows the truth. We won't lose him again." Sophia nodded, though her tears continued to fall. They had uncovered the truth, but now they faced a new crossroads: how to approach Daniel, how to tell Mark that his entire life had been built on a lie. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew they couldn't stop now. They had come too far to turn back, and though the future was uncertain, they were ready to face it together. That night, Sophia and Mary returned home with the weight of the truth on their shoulders. They knew what lay ahead would be even more painful, but they also knew they were one step closer to getting Daniel back. And that gave them the strength they needed to keep going. Sophia and Mary spent the night awake, unable to sleep after Javier's devastating confession. The details of Daniel's abduction, now known as Mark, kept swirling in their minds, like a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. They knew they had to share the information with Andrew, and more importantly, decide how to approach the situation with Mark. But every time Sophia thought about seeing her son and telling him the truth, she felt the weight of what they were about to do crushing her. The next morning, Andrew arrived at Mary's apartment, his face somber and full of worry. Sophia greeted him with a hug that he returned with strength, as if they both needed to hold on to each other to find the strength they knew they would need. "What have you discovered?" Andrew asked as soon as they sat down in the small living room. His voice was tense, as if he already sensed that the news would not be easy to digest. Mary took the lead and began recounting everything Javier had told them the night before. As she spoke, Andrew's face changed, shifting from disbelief to anger, and finally to overwhelming sadness. When Mary finished, the room fell into a heavy silence broken only by Sophia's labored breathing. "They kidnapped him and raised him as their own," Andrew said, repeating the words, as if doing so would help him make sense of them. "All this time, and he doesn't know anything." Sophia nodded, struggling to maintain her composure. Tears were on the verge of spilling from her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not now, not when they had such a crucial decision to make. "We have to tell him the truth," Andrew said finally, with a determination that surprised both sisters. "We can't keep letting him live in a lie. He deserves to know who he is, who we are." "But Andrew, if we tell him the truth like this, all at once, it could destroy him," Sophia replied, her voice full of fear. "He's built a life, a family. We can't just burst in and expect him to accept everything immediately." "I know, Sophia, I know," Andrew replied gently, trying to calm her. "But I also know that if we leave things as they are, if we do nothing, we'll lose the chance to get him back. We can't let him go on living without knowing the truth." Mary then intervened with her practical and determined tone. "I think the key is Laura, his wife. She's the one who knows him best, who is closest to him. If we can get her to understand the situation, she might be the one to help us tell him the truth in the least traumatic way possible." Sophia and Andrew exchanged a look, both knowing Mary was right. Laura was the key to all of this. She was the person Mark trusted, and if they could win her trust first, they would have a better chance of Mark accepting the truth. "How do we do it?" Andrew asked, leaning forward, ready for whatever plan they might come up with. "We need to approach her discreetly," Mary said, already thinking through the details. "We can't just show up and tell her what we know. That would scare her and put her on the defensive. First, we need to gain her trust, make her see that we're not a threat." Sophia nodded, though the fear still gripped her chest. The mere thought of approaching her son's wife, of stepping into his life again, was terrifying, but she knew they had no other choice. "I could try to approach her," Sophia said, her voice barely a whisper. "I could try to talk to her, not directly about all this, but in a way that makes her understand that we're here to help, not to destroy her life." "That could work," Mary replied thoughtfully. "We could find a neutral place, a casual encounter, maybe in the park, the same place where it all began. If she sees that Sophia just wants to talk, without pressure, she might be more willing to listen." Andrew looked at Sophia with concern. "Sophia, if you do this, you need to be prepared for anything. She might not react well. She might reject any attempt at contact." "I know," Sophia replied with more firmness than she felt. "But I have to try. I can't let this opportunity slip by." The plan was carefully laid out. They decided the park would be the ideal place for the encounter. Mary would find out Laura's routine to make sure she was there at the right time. Sophia would simply coincidentally run into her, looking for the opportunity to start a conversation. On the day of the meeting, Sophia felt like she was walking into an abyss. Her heart raced as she headed to the park, dressed simply, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. Mary and Andrew waited nearby, ready to intervene if necessary, though they all knew this was something Sophia had to do alone. When she arrived at the park, she saw Laura sitting on a bench watching Matthew play in the playground. For a moment, Sophia stood still, feeling like her legs wouldn't respond. It was the first time she had seen Laura up close, and the reality of the situation hit her hard. This woman, who was now her son's wife, was a stranger to her, but in her hands was the key to getting Daniel back. She took a deep breath and approached slowly, her mind running over the words she had practiced over and over. Laura didn't see her until Sophia was almost beside her. When she did, she looked up with a polite smile which faded into a slightly confused expression as she saw Sophia stop in front of her. "Hi," Sophia said softly, trying to sound as natural as possible. "Sorry to bother you, but would you mind if I sit here?" Laura, though surprised, nodded kindly. "Of course, no problem," she replied, gesturing to the bench. Sophia sat down cautiously, her heart pounding. For a moment, both women remained silent, watching Matthew play in the distance. Sophia felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, knowing that every word she said from that moment on would be crucial. "Your son is adorable," she finally said, breaking the silence. "How old is he?" "He's 5, Laura replied with a smile that showed the love she had for her son. "He's a very active child, always full of energy." Sophia nodded, feeling a lump in her throat as she thought of Daniel at that age. "It must be wonderful to watch him grow," she said sincerely, though the sadness in her voice was undeniable. Laura looked at her with a more serious expression, as if suddenly realizing there was something more behind Sophia's words. "It is," she replied cautiously. "Do you have children?" Sophia hesitated for a moment, feeling like she was walking a tightrope. "I had a son," she finally replied, her voice breaking with emotion. "But I lost him many years ago." Laura looked at her, now with a mix of compassion and curiosity in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said sincerely. "That must have been very hard." "It was," Sophia admitted, looking at Laura with tear-filled eyes. "And it still is. You never stop feeling that emptiness. You never stop looking for answers, hoping that someday you'll find him." Laura frowned, as if trying to understand the true meaning behind Sophia's words. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly, though her tone held a growing caution. Sophia took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back. "Because I think there's something you need to know. Something that could change everything," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not here to hurt you or your family, but I think there's something you need to know about your husband." Laura's face immediately hardened, her eyes filled with alarm. "What are you implying?" she asked, her tone now defensive. Sophia knew she had touched a sensitive subject and had to handle it with extreme care. "Please don't misunderstand me," she said urgently. "I'm not here to make any accusations or cause trouble. I want you to understand that your husband's life, Mark's life, there are things you don't know, things he doesn't know either." Laura looked at her with distrust, her body tense as if preparing for a confrontation. "What don't I know?" she asked, her voice low but full of warning. Sophia swallowed hard, knowing she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. "We need to talk in private, somewhere we can explain everything to you," she said, her tone pleading. "It's not something I can explain here, but please just give me a chance to explain." Laura remained silent, looking at Sophia with a mix of fear and curiosity. She knew what this woman was hinting at was serious, but she also felt there was something in her eyes, something in her voice, that told her she wasn't lying. "All right," Laura finally said, though her tone remained tense, "but only because I want to understand what's going on. We'll meet tomorrow, at the cafe in the center, at 10 in the morning, and you better have a good explanation for all of this." Sophia nodded, feeling a mix of relief and panic. She knew she had gotten what she was after, but she also knew the real challenge was yet to come. "Thank you," she said softly, standing up from the bench. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Laura didn't respond. She just watched as Sophia walked away, her mind full of questions and her heart heavy with uncertainty. Sophia met up with Mary and Andrew at a safe distance, where they were anxiously waiting for her. "How did it go?" Mary asked immediately as Sophia approached. "She agreed to meet with me tomorrow," Sophia said, her voice weak from emotional exhaustion. "I have to tell her everything. I don't know how she'll take it, but at least we'll have the chance to explain." Andrew hugged her, feeling the tension in her body. "You did well, Sophia," he said gently. "We'll do this together. You're not alone in this." That night, Sophia couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by what was to come. They had taken the first step, but she knew what lay ahead would be even more difficult. Tomorrow, she would have to face Laura and tell her the truth, knowing that conversation could change her son's life forever. But she also knew she couldn't turn back. The truth had to come out, and though the future was uncertain, she knew she was doing the right thing. The next day, the downtown cafe was quiet, with only a few scattered customers at the tables, engrossed in their morning conversations. Sophia arrived early, hoping to calm her nerves before Laura showed up. The cozy atmosphere of the place, with its dim lights and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, did little to ease the tension in her chest. She knew that the meeting she was about to have could change everything, and the weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable. She sat at a table near the window, where she could see the entrance. She had ordered a coffee but had barely touched the cup. Her hands were cold and slightly trembling, and she couldn't stop mentally rehearsing everything she planned to say. She knew she only had one chance to earn Laura's trust, and if she failed, she might lose Daniel, Mark, forever. Finally, the cafe door opened and Laura walked in, looking as calm and composed as she had in the park. However, her eyes betrayed her caution. She quickly scanned the room, and upon seeing Sophia, walked towards her table with a determined stride. Sophia stood up to greet her, trying to smile despite the storm of emotions she felt. "Thank you for coming, Laura," Sophia said as Laura sat down across from her. Laura nodded, not returning the smile. "I wasn't going to ignore this," she replied firmly. "I want to understand what's going on and what you're implying." Sophia took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. She knew she had to be careful, that she couldn't rush or be too direct, but she also knew she couldn't beat around the bush. "Laura, what I'm about to tell you isn't easy for me," she began, keeping her tone soft but steady. "It's something I never thought I'd have to tell anyone, but I need you to trust that I'm not here to harm you, or Mark, or your family." Laura frowned, crossing her arms on the table, as if preparing for an emotional blow. "You said there was something about Mark that I don't know," she said, her voice laced with distrust. "What is it? What do you think you know about my husband?" Sophia felt her heart pound harder. She knew she couldn't delay the conversation any longer, so she decided to get straight to the point. "Mark Daniel," she began, and the name Daniel made Laura blink in confusion. "He's my son, who was kidnapped when he was 5 years old. And I know this sounds impossible, but I swear to you, Laura, it's the truth." Laura's face immediately hardened, her eyes shining with a mix of surprise and skepticism. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone now colder. "Mark wasn't kidnapped. He grew up with his family, with his mother, Caroline. How can you say something like that?" Sophia felt the knot in her throat tighten, but she forced herself to continue. "I know it's hard to believe, but everything you've been told about Mark's adoption, it's not true. He was taken from me years ago, and he was adopted under illegal circumstances. We've investigated, and everything we've found points to my son Daniel being kidnapped and raised as Mark." Laura shook her head, vehemently denying it. "That's impossible," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You can't be telling the truth. Caroline, she wouldn't do something like that." "She did," Sophia replied, feeling the tears threaten to fall. "She did it out of desperation because she wanted a child and couldn't have one, but that doesn't change the fact that Mark, is my son." Laura looked away, clearly struggling with the information she was receiving. The disbelief and anger were evident on her face, and Sophia knew she was losing ground. "I have proof," Sophia said quickly, pulling out a folder she had brought with her. "Papers, testimonies, everything you need to see to understand what happened. I'm not here to take Mark away from you. I just want him to know the truth, and I want you to know it too." Laura looked at the folder warily but didn't take it. Her hands remained tense on the table, as if she hesitated to touch it, as if just doing so would confirm the reality Sophia was presenting to her. "What do you expect me to do with this?" she finally asked, her voice low but tense. "Do you expect me to go home and tell my husband that his life has been a lie? That the woman who raised him is a criminal?" "I don't expect you to do anything right away," Sophia said, her voice now pleading. "I just want you to think about it, to review the evidence. I don't want this to fall on him like a bomb, which is why I came to you first. I know you know him best, and I know that if we can work together, we can find a way to tell him the truth without destroying him." Laura closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to process the impossible. When she opened them again, her eyes were filled with a mix of pain and confusion. This can't be true," she murmured, though her voice lacked the firmness it had before. "Everything I know about him can't be a lie." "It's not a lie what you've lived with him," Sophia said, trying to console her, "but the truth about his past, about who he really is, that truth was hidden for the wrong reasons, and now that I know where my son is, I can't ignore it. But I don't want to do it alone. I don't want to do it without your help." Laura finally took the folder but kept it closed on the table, as if she wasn't ready to face its contents. "I need time to process this," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I can't promise you anything, but I'll review what you've brought, and if I see that what you say is true, I'll talk to him. But if this turns out to be a lie—" "It's not," Sophia interrupted with a certainty that surprised Laura. "And I know you'll see it. I know that, even though this is hard, it's the right thing to do." Laura nodded, though her gaze was still lost in confusion and pain. "I'll call you," she finally said, standing up from the seat. "When I'm ready, I'll call you." Sophia nodded, feeling a mix of relief and fear as she watched Laura leave the cafe with the folder under her arm. She knew she had just handed over the truth to the only person who could help her reveal it in the least destructive way possible. But she also knew that she had placed an emotional bomb in Laura's life, one that could explode at any moment. When Laura left, Sophia remained seated at the table, feeling the emotional exhaustion settle over her like a heavy blanket. She had done everything she could, and now all she could do was wait. Wait for Laura to process the truth and make the decision to talk to Mark. But that waiting would be the hardest part of all. As she left the cafe, Sophia felt the cool air on her face and took a deep breath. She had taken an important step, but she knew the battle was far from over. There were many more truths to reveal and many more wounds to heal. But she was determined not to give up, no matter how difficult the road ahead. The days following the meeting at the cafe were an agony for Sophia. Every phone call, every vibration of her phone made her heart leap, anxiously waiting to hear Laura's voice on the other end of the line. But the phone remained silent, and with each passing day the uncertainty became harder to bear. She knew Laura needed time to process what she had revealed, but the weight was unbearable. She felt that the truth was on the verge of being discovered, but feared that if they didn't act soon, the opportunity would slip away. Finally, after what felt like weeks of silence, Laura called. It was a brief call, with no apparent emotions, just an instruction. "We'll see you tomorrow, at my house. Mark will be there. We need to talk." Laura's voice was loaded with restrained tension, and although she didn't give details, Sophia knew the moment had come. That night, Sophia could barely sleep. Memories of Daniel as a child, of the laughter they shared, and the happy moments flooded her, mixing with the fear and anxiety of what was to come. The face of Mark, the man she had seen open the door that fateful night, kept haunting her mind. How would he react to discovering that everything he believed about his life was a lie? How would he react to seeing the woman who claimed to be his real mother? The next day, Sophia prepared with trembling hands, trying to stay calm, though inside her heart was racing. She knew that Andrew and Mary would be nearby, waiting for her signal, but this confrontation was something she had to face alone. He was her son, and she had to face the truth with him, without intermediaries. The journey to Laura and Mark's house was a blur of emotions. When she arrived, she stood outside the door for a moment, breathing deeply before ringing the bell. She knew that once she crossed that threshold, nothing would ever be the same again. Laura opened the door, her face serious but without the coldness she had shown at the cafe. She gestured for Sophia to come in, and Sophia followed her in silence, her heart pounding so hard she feared Laura might hear it. The house was surprisingly quiet. and when she entered the living room, she saw him, Mark, sitting in an armchair with a look of bewilderment and confusion on his face. His eyes searched hers, trying to figure out who this woman was who had suddenly intruded into his life. "Mark, this is—" Laura began, but her voice broke before she could finish the sentence. Sophia stepped forward, tears filling her eyes, though she tried to maintain her composure. She looked at Mark, the man who, despite everything, was still her son, even if he didn't know it. "Hello, Mark," Sophia said softly, her voice trembling. "My name is Sophia, and I'm your mother." Mark's face contorted in an expression of disbelief and immediate rejection. He abruptly stood up from the armchair, stepping back as if Sophia's words had physically struck him. "What the hell are you saying?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion and restrained anger. "What does this mean? What's going on here?" Laura, beside him, tried to put a hand on his arm, but he pulled away, clearly overwhelmed by the situation. "Mark, please, just listen," Laura said, her tone desperate. She came to tell you something important, something you need to know." "Know what?" Mark exclaimed, his gaze shifting between Sophia and Laura, seeking an explanation. "What am I supposed to know?" Sophia felt the pain in her chest intensify, but she knew she couldn't back down. She had to tell him the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "Mark," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, "your real name is Daniel. You were kidnapped when you were just a child, when you were 5 years old. Caroline took you from me and raised you as her son, but you are my son, my Daniel." Mark looked at her as if she had lost her mind, his expression showing a mix of disbelief and terror. "That doesn't make any sense," he said, shaking his head vehemently. "Caroline is my mother. She always has been. I grew up with her. I have memories. You can't tell me all that is a lie." "I'm not saying those memories are false," Sophia responded, her voice desperate to reach him. "Just that they were built on a lie. You are my son, the son I lost years ago, and all I want is for you to know the truth, so we can understand this together." Mark put his hands to his head, as if trying to stop the avalanche of information hitting him. His breathing was rapid, and Sophia could see the panic taking hold of him. No, this can't be true," he murmured, stepping back. "This isn't possible." Laura tried to approach him again, this time managing to take his hand. "Mark, I know it's hard to accept, but," she said, her voice trembling, "I've seen the proof. I've read the documents. What she says makes sense. I know it's crazy, but we can't ignore it." Mark turned to Laura, his gaze filled with a mix of desperation and betrayal. "And you believe this?" he asked, his voice almost a shout. "Do you believe my entire life is a lie?" "That's not it, Mark," Laura responded, struggling to stay calm. "It's just, if there's a truth that has been hidden all this time, you deserve to know it. You deserve to understand who you really are." Mark let his hands fall to his sides, his gaze lost. For a few seconds, which felt like an eternity, silence filled the room. Then, without a word, he headed for the door, his mind clearly overwhelmed by what he had just heard. "I need to get out of here," he said, opening the door forcefully. I can't deal with this right now." Laura tried to stop him, but he pulled away and left the house, leaving Sophia and Laura in a devastating silence. The door closed behind him with a loud bang, and the sound echoed in the emptiness he left behind. Sophia stood there, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. She had feared this reaction, but even so, the pain was unbearable. She had found her son, but it seemed she had lost him again, this time in an even more painful way. Laura approached her, placing a hand on her arm. "Give him time," she said softly, though her own voice was filled with fear and doubt. "This is a lot for him, but he'll understand. He just needs time." Sophia nodded, though her heart was broken. She knew Laura was right, but she couldn't help but feel that once again, Daniel, her Daniel, was slipping away from her life. She left the house in silence, with Laura's promise to keep her informed when Mark was ready to talk. But as she walked down the sidewalk, she felt the future she had dreamed of, the hope of getting her son back, fading with every step. That night, Sophia met with Andrew and Mary, sharing the devastating experience she had just gone through. They knew the road ahead would be long and painful, but they were determined not to give up. Mark, Daniel, deserved to know the truth. And even though the confrontation had been tough, they also knew that this was just the first step in a long and complex process. Despite the despair, they clung to the hope that in time, Mark would find a way to accept the truth and allow Sophia and Andrew to become a part of his life again. But that night, as Sophia tried to sleep, she couldn't stop thinking about the look of panic in her son's eyes, and she wondered if they would ever find a way to heal the wounds that had just been opened. The days following the confrontation were an emotional hell for everyone involved. Mark had disappeared, leaving Laura and their son Matthew in uncertainty and despair. He wasn't answering their calls or responding to messages, and with each passing day without news, the fear grew that he had decided to walk away from everything, unable to deal with the truth that had been revealed to him. Sophia, on her part, was devastated. She spent hours mentally revisiting every detail of the conversation with Mark, wondering if she could have said something different, if she could have done something to prevent her son's reaction. The pain of finding him only to lose him again was unbearable, and although Andrew and Mary tried to comfort her, Sophia felt her world was falling apart. One afternoon, while Sophia was sitting in her apartment, lost in her thoughts, the phone rang. Her heart leaped when she saw Laura's name on the screen. She answered quickly, her voice trembling with anxiety. "Laura, do you know anything about Mark?" Sophia asked urgently, unable to hide the desperation in her voice. Laura sighed on the other end of the line, and Sophia could feel the weight of exhaustion in her tone. "I found him, Sophia," Laura said softly. "He's at a motel on the outskirts of the city. He's not well. He's completely devastated. He needs time to process all this, but he agreed to talk to you." The relief Sophia felt was immediate, but it was quickly followed by a wave of concern. She knew Mark was suffering, that everything he had discovered had shattered him, and the thought of facing him in that state filled her with fear. "Is it okay if I go now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, he's waiting for you," Laura replied. "But Sophia, please be careful. He's in a very fragile place." "I will be," Sophia promised, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Laura gave her the address of the motel, and Sophia hung up, her mind flooded with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was desperate to see Mark, to try to repair the damage the truth had caused. But on the other hand, she feared what might happen, feared that her son would reject her again, that the distance between them would become insurmountable. When she arrived at the motel, a modest and secluded place, Sophia felt a knot in her stomach. The flickering lights of the motel sign and the heavy evening air gave the place an oppressive atmosphere. She took a deep breath before stepping out of the car and heading to the room Laura had told her about. She knocked softly on the door, her heart pounding. She didn't have to wait long before the door slowly opened. Mark appeared in the doorway, his face pale and exhausted, his eyes red from sleepless nights, and crying. He looked like a shadow of himself, as if the weight of the truth had left him empty inside. "Mark," Sophia whispered, her eyes filling with tears at the sight of her son's state. Mark looked at her silently for a moment before stepping aside to let her in. He didn't say a word as Sophia crossed the threshold and entered the small, cluttered room. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with deep and palpable sadness. "Thank you for coming," Mark finally said, his voice rough and broken. "I wasn't sure if I should call you, but I couldn't keep running away." Sophia nodded, not daring to speak yet, fearing she might say something that would push him further away. Instead, she slowly approached him, as if he were a wounded animal, and looked into his eyes, trying to find a point of connection amidst the storm surrounding them. "I'm so sorry," she finally said, her voice laden with pain. "I'm sorry for everything you've had to go through, for what I made you feel. I never wanted it to be this way. I never wanted you to suffer like this." Mark sank onto the bed, covering his face with his hands. Sophia watched him, her heart breaking at the sight of her son's vulnerability. "I don't know who I am," Mark said, his voice muffled by despair. "Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my life, it's all crumbled. I don't know what to believe. I don't know how to move forward." Sophia knelt in front of him, gently taking his hands and moving them away from his face so she could look him in the eyes. "You're my son," she said firmly, though her voice trembled with emotion. "You're Daniel, and you always have been, even if you didn't know it. But that doesn't mean everything you've lived was a lie. The memories you have, the love you've received, all of that is real. There's just more to your story, something that was hidden out of fear, out of desperation. And now that you know the truth, we can build something new, something that will allow you to heal." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with tears that finally spilled down his cheeks. "How can I trust anyone after this?" he asked, his voice breaking with anguish. If Caroline lied to me all my life, how can I trust what you say? How can I trust what I feel?" Sophia felt a pang of pain at hearing him refer to Caroline as mother, but she knew she couldn't impose her feelings at that moment. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away," she replied gently, "but I am asking you to give me a chance to prove it to you. I'm not perfect, and I can't change what happened, but I want to be here for you. I want to help you find the answers you're looking for. You're not alone, Mark. You're not." Mark looked at her silently for a long moment, as if he were evaluating every word she said, searching for any sign of sincerity. Finally, he nodded slowly, though doubt and pain still lingered in his gaze. "I don't know how to start healing," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but I'm willing to try." Sophia felt an overwhelming sense of relief at hearing those words, though she knew the road to healing would be long and full of challenges. "We'll do it together," she responded, her voice filled with a mix of hope and determination. "Step by step, we'll find the way. No matter how long it takes, I'll be here for you." Mark nodded, though fear and uncertainty still reflected in his eyes. Sophia sat beside him on the bed, and they stayed silent for a while, simply sharing each other's presence, trying to find some comfort amid the emotional chaos. That night, as Mark finally fell asleep, exhausted by the internal storm that had consumed him, Sophia stayed by his side, watching over her son. She knew there was still much to be done, that the road to reconciliation and healing would be difficult, but she also knew that they had taken a crucial first step. The truth had been revealed, and although it had caused much pain, it had also opened the door to possible redemption. Sophia clung to that hope as the night wore on, determined not to give up, determined to reclaim her son one day at a time. The weeks following the initial reconciliation between Mark and Sophia were marked by a slow and painful process of healing. Mark had returned to his home with Laura and Matthew, but their relationship was strained by the weight of the truth they all now shared. Despite Laura's efforts to maintain an appearance of normalcy, the atmosphere at home was fragile, as if one wrong move could cause everything to collapse. Sophia, on her part, was in constant contact with Laura, but respected Mark's need for space. She knew he was struggling with the reality of his past, and how that knowledge had altered his identity. She didn't want to pressure him, but she couldn't help feeling a deep need to be close to him, to help him heal in any way she could. One morning, while Sophia was looking through old photos of Daniel in her apartment, she received a message from Laura. "Mark wants to see you, today at our house at 5 in the afternoon." Sophia's heart raced as she read the message, a mixture of relief and nervousness. She knew this meeting could be crucial for her relationship with her son. She arrived at Mark and Laura's house on time, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. Laura greeted her with a kind but tense smile and led her to the living room where Mark was waiting. He was sitting in the same armchair where he had received the news of his true identity, but now his posture was more relaxed, though his face still reflected the internal struggle he was going through. "Hello, Mark," Sophia said softly, trying to hide the emotion in her voice. Mark nodded in response, gesturing to the sofa across from him. "Hello, Sophia," he replied, his voice calm but laden with a gravity that made every word seem like an effort. Sophia sat down, feeling the air between them was heavy with unspoken things, with repressed emotions that fought to surface. Laura remained standing near the door, giving them space, but making it clear that she was there if they needed her. "I wanted to talk to you," Mark began, running a hand through his hair in a nervous gesture, "about what happened, about everything." Sophia nodded, leaning slightly forward, ready to listen to whatever he needed to say. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Mark continued, his voice low but firm, "and about what it means for me, for my life, and for you." Sophia felt a lump in her throat, but forced herself to stay calm. "I know it's been a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to accept everything right away," she said gently. "I just want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what you decide or how you feel." Mark looked at her with a mix of gratitude and pain in his eyes. "I know and I appreciate that," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I also know I can't keep running from this. I can't just ignore what happened or what it means. I need to understand it. I need to find a way to live with it." "And you will, Mark," Sophia responded, her voice full of conviction. "We'll do it together. You don't have to face it alone." Mark nodded, though his expression still reflected the internal battle he was fighting. "I want to," he began, but then stopped as if the words were too difficult to say. "I want to learn more about my life, before all this. I want to know who Daniel really was, who that child I lost was." Sophia felt a surge of emotions as she heard his words, and she nodded quickly. "I have photos, memories, stories I can share with you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "There's so much I want you to know, so much I want to show you." "I'd like that," Mark replied, though there was a note of caution in his voice. "But I don't know if I'm ready for it all at once. I need to take it slow. I need time to process everything." "We'll go at your pace," Sophia promised, feeling a small part of the distance between them beginning to fade. "There's no rush. The important thing is that we're here, and we're in this together." Mark managed a slight smile, the first Sophia had seen in a long time, and it made her heart fill with renewed hope. "Thank you, Sophia," he said, and though he didn't use the word "mom," the gratitude in his voice was enough to let Sophia know they were moving in the right direction. Laura, who had been watching from a distance, then stepped closer, with a look of relief on her face. "I'm proud of you, Mark," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know this is hard, but I'm here for you, for whatever you need." Mark nodded, covering Laura's hand with his own. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he murmured, looking at his wife with gratitude. The moment was filled with a warm silence, where the three people in the room shared a tacit understanding of what they were facing. It wasn't easy, and they knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time they all felt there was a real possibility of healing. "I'll bring the photos next time," Sophia finally said, breaking the silence with a note of hope in her voice. "And we can talk about whatever you want to know, Mark. I'm here for you." Mark nodded, and though he didn't say anything more, the look in his eyes was enough for Sophia to know they were on the right path. When Sophia stood to leave, Mark walked her to the door, and for a moment they stood in the doorway, sharing a silence that didn't need words. "We'll see each other soon," Mark finally said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll see each other soon," Sophia replied, feeling that those words were a small step toward the reconciliation she so longed for. As she walked to her car, Sophia felt that for the first time in a long time, the weight on her chest was lifting. She knew there was still a long way to go, but she also knew that the hardest part was over. They had begun to rebuild the bridges that time, and lies had destroyed. And although the process would be slow, she was confident that, with patience and love, they would heal the wounds of the past. That night, as she prepared to sleep, Sophia allowed herself to feel a peace she hadn't known in a long time. The image of Mark, her son, willing to try, willing to open himself to the possibility of a new relationship, was the balm her broken heart needed. And with that hope she closed her eyes, knowing that the future, though uncertain, now seemed a little brighter. The day Sophia invited Mark, Laura, and Matthew to her home was one full of promises and memories. Months had passed since that first devastating revelation, and although the wounds were not yet completely healed, everyone had worked together to begin healing. Mark had spent more time with Sophia, learning about his lost childhood, discovering the little things that had made his life as Daniel so special. The journey hadn't been easy. Each step brought a mix of pain and rediscovery. There were days when Mark felt overwhelmed by the weight of his new identity, by the constant struggle to reconcile his life as Mark with the reality that he was also Daniel. But with the unwavering support of Sophia, Laura, and Andrew, he had begun to find balance. He had started to accept that he could be both, that he didn't have to choose between his two lives, but could integrate them into a new, more complete one. Sophia, for her part, had rediscovered her role as a mother, though under circumstances she never could have imagined. She had learned to be patient, to give her son space when he needed it, and to be present when he decided to reach out. Her relationship with Mark was far from perfect, but it was real, and that was all she had wished for so many years. The afternoon when they all gathered at Sophia's home was special. The house was decorated with photos of Daniel's childhood, as well as new images of the moments they had shared recently. There was a warmth in the air that hadn't been felt in a long time, a sense of family that everyone had longed for and that they were finally beginning to regain. "Thank you for inviting us, Sophia," Laura said as Matthew ran toward the photographs, fascinated by the images of his father as a child. "This is my dad when he was little," Matthew said, pointing to a photo of Daniel playing in the park. Mark smiled as he saw his son's excitement. He approached the photo Matthew was pointing to, recognizing himself in the image, though the memories were still fuzzy. "Yes, that was me," he said, and for the first time he didn't feel an internal conflict in saying it. Sophia watched the scene with tears in her eyes, but this time they were tears of happiness. It was a moment she never thought she'd get to live. Her son, her grandson, and the family she had longed for, all gathered in one place. "I wanted to show you something," Sophia said, gently interrupting the moment. She pointed to a box on the table, full of photos and small mementos. "These are things I kept all these years, hoping one day I could share them with Daniel, with you, Mark." Mark approached the box, feeling a mix of curiosity and emotion. He opened the lid and began to take out the photos, one by one, as Sophia told him the story behind each one. There was a photo of his first day at school, one of his third birthday, and another of a sunny day at the park, where he played with a frisbee. As he looked through the photos, Mark began to see flashes of those memories, images he thought would never regain meaning. "I always knew I would find a way back to you," Sophia said, her voice soft but firm. "I never lost hope, and now, having you here, I can't describe what it means to me." Mark nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "I'm starting to remember too," he admitted. "Not everything, but I feel like I'm recovering parts of myself that I thought were lost forever." Laura, who had been quietly observing, approached Mark and took his hand. "The important thing is that you're here with us and that we're together in this," she said, her voice full of love and support. Andrew, who had arrived a little later, joined the group and, seeing his family reunited, felt that after so many years of pain and separation, they were finally complete. The afternoon passed with laughter, memories, and conversations about the future. For Sophia, it was a rebirth, the culmination of a life dedicated to finding her son and rebuilding what time and lies had taken from them. Mark, for his part, began to feel that although his life had changed forever, he wasn't alone. He had a family that supported him, that loved him, and that was willing to walk with him on the difficult path of acceptance and healing. Sophia and Mark's story is one of loss, rediscovery, and finally, redemption. It's proof that even in the most challenging circumstances, love and truth can prevail. Although the truth often brings indescribable pain, it also has the power to heal, to close wounds that have been open for a long time. Sophia teaches us that hope, no matter how faint, should never be lost. Her unwavering faith that she would find her son is what kept her going through years of uncertainty and pain. Mark, on the other hand, shows us that identity is not static but can evolve and adapt, integrating parts of ourselves that we thought were lost forever. This story reminds us that the past, no matter how painful, doesn't have to define our future. With love, patience, and the support of those around us, we can find the strength to face the truth, and from it build a new path. A path that, although full of challenges, can also be full of hope, love, and the possibility of a new beginning. Thank you for joining us in this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. See you in the next one. Goodbye.